Hello everybody! When you're in IT like me, or whether you're a help desk guy, or a system guy, a developer, or an architect, in general, you are the designated support guy for your parents and or family, right? Unless, of course, you have a sibling that's more of an expert than yourself. This is Stef from Samayas, and welcome to my channel. Unfortunately for me, Dave from Dave's Garage just beat me to this video. But then again, I have 1 million followers and he doesn't. Oh wait, it's the other way around. So does the support thing sound familiar to anybody? I was lucky that I'm still young enough to almost be born with a computer in my womb. But however, for my parents, that's a different scenario. I've had my hours of support provided to my parents over the years for the most basic things, unfortunately. Does that ring a bell? I've even went so far to set up a VPN so that I can access all their devices remotely and reconfigure or assist whenever they need something, without me having to drive over for another quote-unquote minor incident on my part, but very major to them. And most of the time it isn't even an incident, but just something they forgot or don't get. Now, taking everything over remotely, but when you MSTSC into a Windows machine, you're in a separate session, or you're taking over a session and kicking that user out temporarily. And of course, it only works when the computer is already booted and or Windows is perfectly functioning. Otherwise, MSTSC is of no help. So, since my parents are aging, I'm rather more frequently than not being called on for the most basic issues that are just dumb things. But even if you take over the session, they are impatient and disconnect you again and again. So I'm kind of fed up with this kind of behavior. So today I'm going to review the GL Comet Pro GL-RM10 KVM. So KVM is an abbreviation of keyboard, video and mouse. Initially, KVMs were only used as devices in a server rack to control 20-some servers with one keyboard, mouse and screen. In a later stage, those KVM devices became network connected. Even later, enterprise servers received a dedicated KVM, just to do the complete remote control through a network card, for instance like the iDRACs of Dell. It is only until a couple of years ago that we have seen started loaded of do-it-yourself devices, although this one is not really do-it-yourself anymore. KVMs started popping up in all different kind of flavors, and since there seems to be a vibrant community around, loads of things are starting evolving quite fast. Now for the home mark, there are different kinds of KVMs on the market, and of course, not all are equal. None of them are perfect, and frankly, even though they all behave as KVMs, some are better suited for some tasks and other for other tasks. A lot of KVMs are just there to remotely manage your machine without you needing to be physical in the same room, or even the same place or country. And in a lot of scenarios, that of course is quite fine. In my scenario, however, I want the computer to be working perfectly normal, with a normal keyboard, mouse and screen, and still be able to access it remotely and provide assistance. The Comet KVM for that is just perfect. It allows for 4K passthrough, which not all others offer. So again, depending on what you need, this might be better suited for your scenario or not. If you just need to take over the computer remotely, you don't necessarily need the HDMI pass-through. As you can see, it is a quite slick device, and it's quite different from a lot of other devices out there. It's rather big, it can just sit on a desktop or hidden away in a corner. Design-wise, from my point of view, the Comet KVM and the Jet KVM are a nice design. Most others seem a lot more sturdy and do-it-yourself devices. But then again, there are also some internal devices which you can just screw in a larger desktop. It's also a matter of point of view. On the backup of the Comet Pro, you have two HDMI ports, an HDMI out and an HDMI in, one Gigabit Ethernet port, a USB-C port for keyboard and mouse, another USB-C port for powering it on, and an older USB 2 port for connecting peripherals. specifically the finger box and the ATX control. And it also supports Wi-Fi and even Wi-Fi 6. So it's pretty up to date, which is good. And even both bands like Wi-Fi 2.4 and 5 GHz are supported. It's using an ARM Cortex-A53 processor, which is rather powerful. And then, something very important, there's a reset button. This Comet Pro, however, compared to a number of other devices, out of the box does not support PoE power in or power over Ethernet. But you can purchase a separate PoE injector cable, or rather split the cable on one side to the RJ45 and the other side to USB or USB-C to power on the device. The front has a nice slick touchscreen where you can see the state, where you can configure certain things. You can see which devices are connected, HDMI, network, Wi-Fi, external devices, etc. You can configure the Wi-Fi, the Ethernet connections and the GL KVM settings. Contrary to a number of other KVM devices, you don't have a direct connection through wiring to power on a PC. They do, however, sell separate devices. The first one is the fingerbot, which you can simply glue on top of any PC to power on that PC. Since I didn't have a need for it, I didn't buy that device, and I can only make some conclusions from what I saw on the internet. The nice thing about the fingerbot is that it can work on any PC, and you might even power on an Xbox or a PS5. The downside, in what I see, is once you install the fingerbot and glue it, it becomes a burden to power on that machine manually. But that's just my 2 cents. And the second device is what they call an ATX device, which does allow you to connect directly inside of a desktop and power it on through the motherboard. Now, of course, none of those devices are perfect. And it always depends on what your needs are. What is more important and what isn't. On the pricing side of things, this is one of the more expensive. But considering it has 2 HDMI ports, Wi-Fi 6, a touchscreen and a decent processor, that seems a quite reasonable price. The only 2 other KVMs that I found out there that had HDMI pass-through were the KVM V4 Plus, but it's more expensive and it does not have 4K, and the BLI KVM, which does have 4K, but is rather built for rack install and doesn't have a slick design, but is a little bit cheaper. If, however, we want to transmit 4K signal of video raw speed, on average we need between 35 and 45 megabits with H.264 compression. If we would be able to compress it with H.265, we'd only require between 4 and 10 megabits. And technically, the Comet Pro hardware might just support this, but there's a very poor support for the H.265 in the current browsers, and so the Comet Pro disabled it software-wise. Now, if you want to use this device for streaming full stream 4K speeds on your internal network, it will work fine. Even on Wi-Fi 6, it's a very good fit. On the older Wi-Fi 2, that'll depend on the number of other Wi-Fi devices and the interference, of course. If you want to stream 4K with this device on the internet, of course, there's a lot more factors to take into consideration. Your internet upstream and downstream, the internet upstream and downstream on the other side, and potential VPN connections. So, let's dig in. The initial start takes roughly 25 seconds. And then the screen asks you to enter a screen password. And for that, I'll simply set 0000. Then you need to validate and re-enter 0000 and confirm. And now I choose continue. And now you need to set up your network. And you have a choice between Wi-Fi and Ethernet. And I'll be choosing Ethernet. And here again, I need to choose continue. And since I'm on DHCP, automatically I receive an IP address. And so my network config is done. And the icons on the bottom show me I have no keyboard and mouse, no HDMI in, no HDMI out, and no USB. Next, in the upper left corner, it shows me I have an Ethernet connection. In the upper right corner, I have a time. And in the middle, I have an IP address. So after a while, the Comet screen goes out. And if you touch it First, you get the hour and date. If you touch it again, it asks you to enter the password which you've initially configured with. And only then can you see the IP address, whether or not the KVM is connected, whether or not an HD in and HD out are connected, etc. If I flow up, I can reboot or lock the screen. If I go down, I have more details like the model name, the KVM version, the MAC address, legal information. If I go to the right, I can change screen display settings and I can make it more or less rightful. I can enable or disable the screen lock. I can change the password and I still need to enter the current password, which is good. And I can have the auto screen lock changed to 10 seconds, 30, 1, 3 or 5 minutes. For now, I'll put it on 5, or I can also have it to always on, and then it'll always show the time. I can enable or disable Wi-Fi. I'm currently using a connected version, so I won't be configuring Wi-Fi. And or I can enable or disable the cloud service. And out of the box, the cloud service is configured. And so I can disable it, or I can enable it again. And once enabled, I can generate a dynamic code, and it gives me a code which allows me to log in. And it's more or less like an OTP password. And to the left, there's nothing. So that's more or less all options you have on a small device. So let's try an initial power on and see how much time it takes before our screen starts transmitting. 24 seconds, roughly. But then again, you will probably leave this device powered on all the time anyway. And now it's ready and it receives an IP address. So now the Comet Pro is connected on one side to my laptop and on the other side to the input device. And let's see how much time it takes before I receive an input. And so now I have my BitLocker screen, but still no signal. And still no signal. And only now do I get an output. And you might think that in essence that's a Comet Pro problem. However, it isn't. It's a laptop problem. Most laptops only activate their HDMI port once the OS is booted. And that is as well for Windows as for other OSs like Linux, etc. So if you want to have full boot access on a laptop and use a Comet Pro or any other KVMI like this, think again. Now I'll be powering on a small Dell Optiplex and no laptop anymore. And let's see how much time and if we see everything this time. There's no other screen connected anymore, so we should receive the BIOS information and everything. Let's power it on. And here, after a few seconds, we immediately see the boot screen, which is good. And it's powered on. So now let's connect to the Comet for the first time. And it automatically goes to HTTPS. And I have a security prompt for a certificate which is not supported, which is understandable. So I accept the risks and I continue. And the first thing it prompts me is to enter an administrative password. And here it's good to have a complex password. I'll enter a password and I choose apply. And now at first it asks me for a security prompt and whether or not Firefox needs more rights. So I'll say apply. And here I immediately have the screen. If I double click on it, my screen reacts, which is okay. I can enter a password and I'm connected to my Windows device. So after being logged in, the first block here is the settings. And when you click on settings, you have a tab on the left opening with loads of different options. First, you have a choice for the video speed. You can choose between two modes. You have the smart mode or the normal mode. And if you're connecting from your device from somewhere else than a physical location, at the other side of the world, from your vacation home or whatever, the smart mode is a better option. You have no really any control about the speed. you can just choose between the transmission types and the resolution. If you go for normal mode and you're locally on your same network, then you have the choice between ultra high, high, medium, and low. And of course, if you just have somewhere on your network a headless device and you want to stream something, well, you'll go for ultra high, so that you have a good quality and you see it back. And so the priority of the normal mode is to give you quality as much as possible. The priority of a smart mode is to balance latency and video quality depending on your networking speed. And so even if you're on a smartphone or something like that, or on a bad internet connection, you can still connect to the device on the other side of the Comet Pro, which is quite nice. And then next, independently of whether you choose the smart or the normal mode, you can choose the transmission. Both transmission types in essence use H.264 for encryption. However, WebRTC is specifically used for video calls, like for instance Google Chat, Discord, etc. And for that, it uses peer-to-peer connections, and however, it might be more complex to pass a firewall. If you're internal, in general, that's not an issue. If somehow you need to get through a firewall and this device is only exported to HTTPS and you haven't opened any extra ports, well, WebRTC won't work. The alternative is direct H.264, and there it uses WebSockets. And so there it just passes through HTTP or HTTPS, making your firewall management a lot better, but you might lose in streaming performance. And then the final drop-down is the EDID, Extended Display Identification Data, which is a complex word simply for choosing the video resolution. And in there, depending on your system, you can choose resolution. Out of the box, it started at 2560 x 4440, but I scaled it down to 1920 x 1080 because the other resolution for filming this was too high. So let's switch back to 2560, and it takes a while, and now our resolution is much smaller. I can even go to 3840. Of course, that'll depend on the graphics card inside your system. Keep in mind, if you change that, you don't only change the resolution here, but you also change the resolution on the physical monitor who's connected. I can also go to 9020 x 1200, and it takes some time to adapt. I can go to 16-1200, but that one wasn't working on the system. And finally, I can go to 2560 x 1440, and this one isn't working either, so I'll just fall back again to 1920 x 1080. Now this is the view that you get on your remote through the browser. Now if I screen grab immediately the output of the Comet Pro, which should actually be the input to a monitor, and we do the same thing, well, we clearly see it's switching over. I just switch to 2540, I have suddenly no signal, and then the computer switches over. I switch back to 3840, no signal, and that's 3840. I go back to a resolution which is not working, which is 16 x 1200, and I'll get some gibberish. I go back to 9020 x 1220, and this one again is not really supported. I switch to 1920 x 1200, and this one again is having issues, and so finally I scale back to 9020 x 1080. And so, depending on who's on the other side, and depending on what the functionality of this KVM is, it has an impact. If you're just taking over a system yourself, well, you can do whatever you want. If you want to assist somebody, like in my scenario for this Comet Pro is the case, I absolutely do not want to start playing around with that, because the user on the other side will see those switches as well. Now, when playing around with it, I still notice some quirks. The computer on which I'm recording and which I'm connecting, and the computer connected to the Comet Pro, is sitting one next to the other. I'm in normal mode, high quality, transmission WebRTC. There's no firewall in between, and if I switch from WebRTC to DirectH, suddenly the video stops playing, and so even after a refresh, my direct H.264 in Firefox is having some issues. And so if I switch from high to medium, that still doesn't make any difference. If I switched from medium to low, even, well, low at some point had some difference, but not much, but in essence totally unusable. Now if I switch back to smart, hello everybody, tended to have a more complex password for breaches over the years. Like for instance, even more funny, the Ashley Madison, because on one side, on my direct screen, for simplicity, I see my mouse moving. I use the same password everywhere, right? If I go again back to the browser, I do the same exercise and nothing is happening. Simply because I'm in direct H.264. But maybe that's a Firefox issue. So for now, let's switch back to WebRTC, and there everything is working. Now, let's have a look at our remote device settings. First, we have a speaker. Next, we have the microphone. By design, the speaker is disabled, and if you just want to support somebody, you don't need the sound coming from that system. If, however, you're using this to have a view on a headless device and you want full streaming, well, then you absolutely want to listen to what happens. Now I won't go into details on how to best save a password into the database. On WebRTC, everything's working fine. New password and the very secure ones. When switching to high WebRTC, I hear the audio, but I don't see the video anymore. So I need to refresh. Hello everybody. So the last couple of days and after a refresh, the audio is working, the video is working, but so from time to time it still seems quite tricky. Now let's try to activate the microphone, and it's a lot more funny. And I don't know why they did it, maybe a security feature, but activating the microphone requires the Comet Pro to really reboot. So the moment I flag the microphone, it asks me to modify the system settings and whether or not I agree to reboot the system. And so I'll say yes. Here my connection is lost. And suddenly my Comet is rebooting. And of course, 25 seconds later, more or less, the Comet is rebooted. And so while the Comet is rebooting, of course, the screen in between doesn't have any input. And now the Comet is almost back. And now it's reconnecting. It requires a password again. And we're back. And now, even though the microphone is activated here, by design it's muted. If I unmute it, of course, in Firefox, I need to choose which microphone potentially I'll be using. I'll mute it for now. And the moment I want to disable this feature again, I have exactly the same prompt and I need to restart a second time. So since I don't need the microphone, I'll redisable and reboot. And so the next part of our settings from remote device settings is the keyboard. And of course, if my keyboard is on, I can simply type. And if I want full remote control, I enable it. If, however, I need to give remote assistance and I don't necessarily want to intervene myself, I can decide to simply see what the user is seeing and give remote help and not intervene. And so now if I disable, my mouse is still working, but the keyboard isn't. Now, on the other hand, if I enable a keyboard, locally, I even have the possibility to show a virtual keyboard, which you only see here and not on the other side. However, well, I'm in Luxembourg and I have AZERTY keyboard. And as far as I can tell, the moment this keyboard pops out, it's a QWERTY keyboard and I haven't really now found the option to change. The next option is to enable or disable the mouse. And if I move my mouse over the KVM screen, I can see my mouse moving and I can slowly see the mouse on the physical machine also moving with a slow delay. If I disable my mouse, well, I can still see the mouse on the physical screen, but my mouse movement on the KVM does not have an impact for the user on the other side. However, if I go back to the physical screen and the physical output, even though I'm playing around with my mouse, the user sees the mouse just the same. If I re-enable local cursor, well, on my side of things, I see two cursors. The end user still only sees their cursor moving. But if somebody remote takes it over and they see the mouse moving, that might freak them out. And then the next feature is mouse jiggle. Of course, everybody who's a hard worker knows where it's for, right? Of course, there's always remote, legit scenarios. You don't know the password of the person, but you still need to take control. Well, mouse jitter temporarily prevents that system from going to sleep or locking. And so even if you have to temporarily switch to another window, that system will stay active. So it isn't such a bad feature. Next, we have the scroll rate and the scroll direction. Well, the scroll rate, if you have a mouse with a scroll, decides on how fast something scrolls up or down. And then next you have a scroll direction. Standard for the Windows way, if I scroll down, my page scrolls down. On the Mac way, it's the other way around. And if you want to have the same behavior for Mac, well, you'd simply choose vertical inverted. And then I have to scroll up to go down or down to go up. And I can have the same simply for horizontal and not just vertical. But for my page, I can't really do this. Or I have both, where both horizontal and vertical are inverted. As a Windows user, in general, you'll choose standard. As a Mac, it depends. And another very important or nice feature, especially if you have to give support to somebody, well, the first feature is to simply disable the mouse, and so you don't bugger a person. The second feature, if you still want to easily take over control, is to put the mouse mode, instead of absolute, where you can see what you're doing, in relative mode. In relative mode, even if you move your mouse over the screen, nothing is happening. So if I go back to my real output, I'm still moving my mouse, but on output, I don't see anything. And in order to take control in relative mode, you need to click once. And once you click once, your Firefox or other browser gives you a prompt saying that it took control. And now you only have one mouse, and from now you have control of the mouse. But if you now go all the way up to the top, well, this is the limit. I can't get out this virtual window anymore. And if I do the same thing and I switch my view, well, I can't go out. And so the last feature is the relative sensitivity of the mouse. I put it at 1.8, and so if I take control, my mouse moves quite fast, since I like it fast. However, if I switch back to like 0.4, and now I move my mouse, suddenly the mouse movements are really slow. So it's up to you. It's in essence the same feature that you have on most Windows and Mac PCs, where you can control the speed of your mouse locally. Well, here you can do the same thing remotely. And then finally, under device identity, again, I have a custom mode. I have the choice between GL-KVM default, 1080p, 2K or 4K. But according to the documentation, if I switch here to 4K, automatically my ED ID will also switch. And the difference here apparently is when I switch this, is that the system actually needs to reboot. And so now I switched to 4K. Well, my screen resolution automatically went to 4K. And on one side, my ED ID went to 4K as well. And here my device identity went to 4K as well. And so, as the documentation states, the device identity is automatically linked with the EID. But if I switch EID back to 1K, I do not need to reboot, and they both are aligned. If I go back here and let's say I want to go to 2K, suddenly my device needs to restart again. And I must admit, I'm probably not the most intelligent guy in the world. At first glance, that doesn't really make much sense. However, it's only when you start digging further and go to customize that you might start to understand it. Yes, you do have the resolution, but you can also choose the USB type. And the reboot is probably linked to the fact that if I go for 1000p, it simulates a Logitech keyboard. If I go for a 2K, it simulates a Corsair gaming RGB. If I simulate a 4K, it simulates a Dell keyboard. So now let's go for the customization, and let's switch from Corsair to a Dell Pro keyboard. Let's confirm, and it needs to be rebooted again. And so now I switch to a Dell multimedia keyboard. And if I look at my device drivers, I should see a difference, but the only thing I see two HID compliant mouses and I see an HID keyboard. And so now I switch to a Logitech keyboard. And if I now look at my device drivers, it says I have a Logitech mouse, I have an extra USB input, I have a Logitech app, and I can have some settings. And one of the main reasons, potentially, if you need to share that screen to another app, is by not having the GL-KVM drivers, so that the other party cannot see that potentially you are taking remote control of your system, and hiding that. Other than that, there's not much sense for it. And so, if you go to Customize, I switch back my USB device to GL-KVM default, and even if I go inside, I have USB input devices, I have a HID keyboard, and I have a HID compliant mouse. And somehow, I never seen a GL-KVM somewhere. But that'll probably depend on the OS you're running on it. Even after doing a search, nothing seems to change. So it's a possibility that can be used. And next, of course, is the must-have language. Well, the Comet Pro, of course, is created by a Chinese function. And so, as a language, next to English, of course, you have Chinese. If you want any other language, well, at this time, you're out of luck. And since my Chinese is so fluent, I won't go in there. And of course, for the hardcore people under us, you have light mode and you have a dark mode. Me, I'm a light guy. But a lot of people are the other way around. So it's there and it's available. And next you have a time zone. Currently it's in UTC 00. And then of course we can switch a time zone. Luxembourg is located in UTC +1. And there's only one issue with this time zone. A lot of countries have winter and summertime. And here, at first sight, there's not really an option to change that. The display on itself has the option to always show the time. And at first sight, that seems a nice feature. However, since we don't have a designation when you need to switch from UTC 1 to UTC 2, half of the year, the time will be incorrect, unless you manually correct it, of course, which somehow seems like a bummer. Now, of course, this totally makes sense. Out of the box, this is a Chinese device, and China doesn't observe daylight saving times anymore since 1991. So why would they implement a feature, right? Well, as a European, some years ago, they promised us to stop that as well. But politically, nothing has changed yet, so we're still stuck with summer and winter time. And then the must-have button, of course, if for whatever reason you want to resell this and remove all settings, is a reset KVM. Of course, resetting device will lose everything. For now, I won't do that. And so, of course, the last setting is networking. Out of the box, this device is configured to use DHCP. And so, I can modify and I can switch from DHCP to static. And especially if you want to use that device in multiple locations and you want to be sure that your device, which you absolutely need to reach, stays on a fixed IP address, switching to static is a good idea. And when you switch to static, you need to give an IP address, a net mask /24/16, the gateway, so they can reach the internet. If you want to have this device access to the internet, a DNS server, 1 or 2. Again, if you want to have this device accessible to the internet. If you're just running this device locally and you don't want it to have connection, well, simply don't provide those data. Personally, I prefer to use DHCP and then static leases, so that on one side I don't have to locally configure my device, and on the other side that my device always still receives the same IP. And on top of that, on my firewall where my DHCP server is located, I have a list of all my devices. But that's just me. And then next to networking, I personally won't be using Wi-Fi, but you can also use Wi-Fi, and the moment you click on it, it'll do a search and it'll try to find the Wi-Fi hotspots. And first, it found my main Wi-Fi hotspot, the encrypted one, the guest one. Next, it found my Elgato key light, it found my tail camera, and it found my GVM light, again with the frequency one next to the other. And so I can just select one and choose connect. And it was also able to connect directly to guest. And it automatically received an IP address. And for now, I'll switch disable again, since I won't be using Wi-Fi. And again, no Wi-Fi anymore. And now, I've resized my window a little bit, so you can see the bottom. First of all, we can see if we are connected with a green LED, we can see that it's using WebRTC instead of direct. We can see the resolution. We can even see the kilobytes a second and frames per second it's currently using. And if, for instance, I'll play back a video again, that might change rather than if I'm using static one. Suddenly it goes up a little bit, but it also depends on the complexity of the video. I'll pause it again. And on the right, it shows that my stream is active or not. It shows that I have a keyboard or not, that I have a mouse or not, that I have sound or microphone. Pretty neat. Now we have a toolbox, and the first one is a clipboard. And in here we can, for instance, copy paste something. And at first sight that seems very nice. However, MSTSC and other remote KVMs simply support copy paste. Of course, not all of them. But if I try this here, well, not so much. And as you can notice, in my copy paste, I copied something www and it translated in ZZZ. And so in essence, it went from AZERTY to QWERTY. And next to English US, well, let's try French if it's in the list. And now let's try repasting. And now it's okay. At least, even after log on, log out, it stays in the keyword you last chose. But, well, having a copy paste who works directly is a lot easier. Then next, of course, we have the shortcuts, Windows Ctrl-Alt-Delete. For instance, we have Alt-Left, Shift-Left. We have Alt-Left Tab to switch between apps. We have to close the app, Alt-L F4. And as a final list, we have Windows P for switching between presentation and Ctrl-L W. And we can add shortcuts ourselves, which at least give you a possibility to do certain things. Pressing Ctrl-Alt-Delete here will simply Ctrl-Alt-Delete my current machine and not my KVM machine. But those special keys are on most KVMs an issue. And then pressing Wake on LAN, when your Comet P is active but the device isn't, when pressing Add Device, it'll search locally and it'll try to retrieve all MAC addresses and IP addresses of all devices accessible by the Comet P. And then it gives you a list, and then from there you can select a device to add. And currently my device ends with 94, so I select Apply, and so now it's there. And then I can send a wake request if the device is shut down. But that only works if the device network card and the system supports Wake on LAN. If your system doesn't support it, you can add it here whatever you want. Your device still won't power up and you manually need to power up. Now, if this doesn't work, the Comet ecosystem, they also sell a finger bot, which is like a finger which presses on a power on button, which you can glue, quote unquote, on top of the device you want to remote control. And then once you have linked it with your Comet Pro, you can send a request and it'll act like a finger, and you can even configure the intensity of the press if you need harder or less harder. In some scenarios, if this is a completely remote system and Wake on LAN doesn't work and that device is only accessed remotely, that's perfect. If, however, it's a system that is sometimes accessed locally and sometimes accessed remotely, having a finger bot on top doesn't seem a nice solution to me. But that's just me. Box is a terminal. And here you can have terminal access directly to your Comet Pro, not to your system on which you're connecting. And here you have a Linux underneath. I can do an ls. I can go to bin. I can try to find whatever apps are there. And I can fuck things up or I can tweak things. So the next tab in the Comet arsenal is the accessory tab. And currently I have not installed any accessories. The first accessory would be the fingerbot, and the second accessory would be an ATX control board, which you plug directly inside a bigger PC. And so in essence, once it detects either of those devices, you can probably remote power on that device to the Comet, and not specifically to the Windows itself. And of course, a feature that every KVM should have, and mainly comes from the server KVMs, is the possibility to have virtual media. In essence, when you have a server from scratch, it's completely empty and you need to install it at some point. And so the easiest way is to stick a USB in the back with an ISO on top and install it. Now, if you need to do dozens of them, it takes more time and it might be easier to do it remotely through a KVM. Or if you're on a vacation on the other side of the world and you need to do it, a virtual KVM allows to do that. Now if you look back at the KVMs a la Dell, etc., you connect a virtual KVM from your computer to the server. The nice thing about that is that you don't have any local storage and that all the data stays on your computer and goes all the way to the server through that connection you have. And if you have a fast connection, that's nice. If however you have a slow connection, the install time will go up considerably. If you look at a Comet Pro here, they took it the other way around. And as you can see, I have 26 GB available to put local ISOs on there. And the good thing, or the bad thing here, is that I first need to upload my ISO to Comet, and then I can probably choose the ISO to boot. The fact that it's local is that your upload time might be slower, but once it's there, the install time will be faster. So I'll drop a small Linux ISO as an example. I just do drag and drop, and it'll upload that locally. And now I have an ISO to use, so I'll try to mount this. And so, when choosing mount to remote, I have two options. As a file share, which means that if I click on file share, this ISO will be directly available in my Windows. So let's try that. Automatically, I have an E drive, which I can access. And also, I can choose to open this PC, open the drive, use a file transfer, or stop. So now, I have my E drive with the ISO available. And if you have put some drivers, some other files, again, if you're using MSTSC, sharing files between your local host and the device you're connected to, you can do it through copy-paste. Here, that doesn't really work. And through the virtual media, you first upload the files you want to share to your Comet Pro, then you say share, and then the device itself you can access, which is a pretty good way to easily share files. And if you want to stop it, again, I go to stop sharing and my share is gone. The second way to mount is to use the image mount itself. And then, instead of having the ISO available, I'll have the content of the ISO available. And so the second way to mount, instead of simply sharing the file like that, an ISO can be mounted. And so I go for image mounting and I choose mount as CD-ROM and I choose the ISO I want to mount. And I simply say mount image. I hide those helpers and now my D drive is the mounted ISO. And once I'm in my E drive, I see my puppy image. And so now technically, if I go for a restart and go to the BIOS menu, and after some very long insistence, I got to my BIOS menu. And now I'm booting from the ISO specifically installed. And I could start to install TrixiePub on this machine. And so I took a very small ISO, but I can install whatever I want. Pretty neat, right? And so everything was ready for setup. I'll simply restart. And if I want to get rid of this image again, well, I simply click delete and the image is gone. The next tab is the App Center. And then under the apps, I have currently one app, Tailscale. And Tailscale allows you to create secure and encrypted network connections. I won't be going into details about Tailscale since that's a video on its own. And finally, we have a little help button with an about box which shows you the latest version, but you also see the latest version here, which gives you a help document which immediately goes to their website and which allows you to export log files in case you have some issues. And opening up the zip of this log file gives you a complete output of whatever happens. If I go to log read, well, you have a typical output of Linux. And then a nice feature, if you want to hide this little bar, is you have a collapse toolbar. If you want to uncollapse it, you have an expand toolbar. And of course, we have a full screen. If you go full screen, the whole screen will be filled up. Well, in my scenario, since it's a 4K screen, it's quite big, and pressing escape undoes that. The documentation part is split over 3 pages and is quite basic. We have the overview, we have the quick setup guide, And we have a little bit more advanced control panel. And that's about it. And then next, I see what the version of this device is running. I have a nice little icon, new version. So let's click on that, and I can upgrade from the default factory version which I've received, which is V161, and latest version is V172. I can save the current configuration. I even have a local upgrade, so probably if I download it myself, I can upload it, and I'll choose Save Configuration and Upgrade Now. And it tells you what will be upgraded, and the upgrade process is running. And at the same time, on the device, you also see upgrading. On the device itself, you don't see percentages, and you only see the web browser. And on one side, it shows 45%. On the other side, it doesn't show updating anymore, but it re-shows GL.iNet. So this is just a timer that automatically updates client-side scripting. At the same time, your GL.iNet is already rebooting. And now the reboot is done. I can see the time again. But on the other side, I'm still at 85. Time is back, the counter continues, and probably at the end, it'll just do a refresh. And I'm at 100%, while the device was already live. And so now it asks me to log in again. Well, at least it shows me that my version is up to date, but it'll only show you that if the device can connect to the internet. And the latest button is Logout. Very simple, right? I log out, and so I can re-log in. The previous one is quite simple as well. Reboot. I choose to reboot, and my local device is rebooting. And reboot is done. And I need to log in again. Now, let's have a look at the security aspects of the Comet Pro. First, we have a security icon, and here, the first option, we can change the admin password. And in order to change the admin password, well, we first need to know the old password, and then we need to enter the new password twice, which is quite okay. Now, what is missing? When initially we set up our device, we had to also enter a PIN. And I might be blind, but in none of the options I've seen where I can change or even visualize that PIN. So now, how do we activate two-factor authentication? Well, under security, we have a 2FA auth, and you click on it, and it shows a QR code or a text, and you can just then afterwards scan it on your authentication app, and then you press next, and you enter your 6-digit code from your authenticator app, and your two-factor authentication is enabled. And if I now do a log out, and then afterwards I log in again, I need to give a password and a 2FA key, and I'm back in. Now, a couple of remarks. On a lot of sites where you need to have 2FA authentication, they also provide backup keys. Here, I haven't really seen that. The good thing is that even though if you forget your key, you can still do a factory reset by physically clicking on the reset button in the back and not just through the settings and do a reset here. And even though two-factor authentication is enabled, if I open PuTTY, it asks me for login, which is root. I enter the password and no 2FA. And now another security issue as well. If I want to change the admin password, at least I have to enter the old password. If I want to disable 2FA, I have a radio button, turn off 2FA, yes, no, I apply, and it's disabled. And so the moment this stays logged in, somebody cannot change your username, but he can disable the 2FA without entering the previous 2FA, which in essence is also a vulnerability. So, what else is missing security-wise? Well, the issue with a certificate. Now, of course, I want this device to be in HTTPS, and out of the box, they configure a certificate which is not trusted, etc., which has a start and end date. And the first laughable thing is that even if you would configure it correctly by naming The start date starts at 1970 and the end date ends at 1979. Now, of course, the moment you accept this, well, you have a not trusted certificate, but you can continue. However, I do know this is not an enterprise product, but even as a Homelabber, I always like to control my certificates and have full trust and add my own certificate. And I have found nowhere an option to provide a custom certificate, which is quite a pity. Now, being a hacker and a Homelabber, I wasn't satisfied with the SSL, so I decided to dig in a little bit deeper. And I was able to connect Winbox directly to the Comet Pro. Username, root, password, the password you predefined. Pretty neat, right? However, with great power comes great responsibility. So since you immediately have root access, you can fuck this up completely. Now, after digging around, I went to the etc directory, then to the KVMD, then to the user directory, and then to the SSL. And in there, I found two files, server.srt and server.key. And so, I went back to my own internal certification server, I created a certificate I needed, I used the necessary tools to get my key file and to get my cert file. And so now, after opening up the server.key file, I was expecting to see a file with RSA inside. Instead, I see begin EC instead of begin RSA, and apparently the current key is based on EC or elliptic curve. However, under the hood, Comet Pro is using Nginx, and Nginx supports both RSA and elliptic curve. So I'll give it a shot first with my RSA key. And then next, the server certificate looks something like this. And in my scenario now, it'll be something bigger because that was a self-signed certificate. And now I'll have a combination between my root certificate and my specific current certificate. And so here again, I'll save. And so now technically the KVM has a new certificate. And the only thing I still need to do is to reboot. I log on with the old certificate and I do a reboot. And now let's see if it works. And after a restart, again, I have a warning. So I go to advanced and now it has a bad certificate domain. And now let's have a look at the certificate. And I have my root certificate and I have a certificate I wanted. So why is it still not working? Well, very simple. Because I'm accessing it now through an IP address and not to the host name. I've quickly updated my DNS server. If I now go to the DNS name which I specified, suddenly I don't have any warning anymore. So I fixed through WinSCP the SSL issue. But having it in the website would be much more easy. So now let's see how we can brute force our Comet Pro. A simple login request. If we have a look at our developer tools of our browser, if I simply log in, the first request is a post with the username and password. Very simple. If, however, I enter the wrong password, I simply receive a pop-up that the login failed, and here I receive a 403 with a post request, and I receive a forbidden, and the request is simply the username and a wrong password. So this could be very easily automated at first sight. So now let's try 5 times a wrong password. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And after 5 times the right password, I can still log in. And now let's retry the right password. And even though it doesn't show, there is still a mechanism that after a number of failed attempts, your system is locked. And you probably need to wait an amount of time before you can log in again. So it's a matter of point of view. On one side, they don't show you devices locked out for wrong attempts. On the other side, they do lock it out for wrong attempts. For how long? I don't know, however. But then, doing a shell, I'm in again. And so that doesn't apply to this at first sight. While the web interface is still locked. But then again, logging into the shell and there's no timeout. Or maybe the distinction is that in the shell, I log in with root, while in the web browser is admin. So let's try a shell with admin. And here suddenly we have an access denied. And after a reboot, let's try the admin again. And so I can't use the admin for the shell. So it isn't related. While after a reboot, I can still again log in. So at least something is in place to prevent brute force attacks. But then again, you might as well say that instead of just using username and password, you also require true FA, which makes an extra step, of course. It's all a matter of point of view. And the second step is the forget password. That seems easy, right? Well, not so much as well. For ease of use, of course, if it's your own device and you forgot the password, the only thing you need to do is touch the reset button on the back for 10 seconds. It'll reboot and your password is gone. So the moment somebody has physical access to that device, he can easily reset it. But then again, if you have physical access to the device, you might as well have physical access to the computer underneath. This is not something that can be done remotely. Well, I have the reset KVM option, but that is probably the nuclear option. So let's have a look at reset KVM. And since I don't have a lot of data, I'll just confirm and execute a full reset. And so, in the web browser, nothing is happening anymore. However, on the device, it's clearly showing resetting. And the device is starting up. And it's as if I start from scratch. I need to configure password again. I need to reconfirm. My password is set. I need to again configure Ethernet in my scenario, and I'm up and running again. So, according to documentation, if I do a ping GL-KVM.local, it'll resolve. Yet, my local Windows workstation connects to my DNS firewall, who connects to a Pi-hole, who connects to the internet. And at no time did I define GL-KVM.local. So then how can it work? Well, in essence, for that, it's using mDNS, or multicast DNS. And mDNS operates at a link local level using multicast IP address match. And so it sends out a request to 224.0.0.251 on port UDP 5353, and then the local KVM will respond with a response. And in essence, Windows knows that if I'm using a .local domain, instead of using normal DNS, it'll be using mDNS. And that's the trick. Now, of course, that's always an option you can disable if you really want to. And in an enterprise environment, it might be a good idea to disable that functionality. Now, let's do a quick port scan and let's see what comes back. And let's scan the first 1000 ports. And what comes back is port 22 in SSH. So we can shell in, we can have a winbox, we have port 80, we have port 443. And the MAC address resolves to gltechnologies.com, which is correct. So that means we can also easily put it in. Username, root, password, whatever you defined, and we have full access to the system, just as to the website. Pretty easy, right? Now, when doing a port scan, we've previously seen that port HTTP and port HTTPS is open. If I simply change it to port HTTP and I go for it, it'll automatically redirect to HTTPS, which of course is a good thing. However, something that is missing in the web browser configuration is to potentially remap HTTPS to something more custom, if you require that. Of course, if you have a firewall in front, you can always do port remapping there, should you want to expose that immediately to the internet, or if for whatever other reason you want to run another port than 443. Now, of course, changing 443 to another port is not security, but it's just obscuring some things. However, even though it is not available to the web interface, it is still doable. So for that, again, I have my good old WinSCP, and we go to etc kvmd, and then we open the nginx kvm config file, and here, if you scroll down a little bit, part of the section is already there. Now the simplest one would simply be to simply modify and remove 443 and change it to whatever port you want. The alternative is to completely uncomment this section and put a second port, like for instance 888 or something else. Doable, up to you. And now, the latest missing piece here is cloud services. And if we click on cloud services, first we have to enable it. We have to click on enable again, 2 times. And now that it's enabled, the device can connect specifically to the internet. And so as the message states, I can remotely access the device by using KVM platform or client. But I first need to bind either with KVM Cloud or with a code. And here you have two choices. Either when you click on bind to KVM Cloud, it automatically redirects and automatically all the information is transmitted to the GL network, so you don't have to do anything anymore. You just have to create an account and the binding happens automatically. And in most situations, that's good enough. However, there might be situations where there's still a VPN in between or some redirects are not happening, and then if you want, you can also manually do it. Go to the GL website and then manually copy the code from bind with code and transmit that. The bind with code is valid for 60 seconds and then it times out. And the bind with code is also directly available on the device. And so in the browser, when you do bind with code, well, you receive a code and you see how long this code is valid. And after that, you'll have to generate a new code, which is more or less the same type of code that you have on your two-factor authentication. Except on your 2FA, it's all integers of 6 long, and here we have alphanumeric of 8 long. Now if you go to bind to cloud, automatically there's a redirect, and here I need to enter a username and password and log in, or I can log in with Google, or the first time I need to sign up. And so I'll choose sign up. I need to choose a region, very specific. Africa is excluded, America, Europe and Asia Pacific. And so I enter my username, I enter an auto-generated password, I enter my email address, and then if I send code, automatically I'll receive an email in my code. And I just need to do I agree and sign up. Very simple, right? And after sign up, it asks me for my username, password, and I'll simply click on login. And now my bind is done, and I can remotely access my local IP. Even though I'm on the internet, I can click remote control. It's asking my same password again, and through the internet, I can see my device. I can change the settings, and again, WebRTC is working, and now it's as if I'm somewhere at the other side of the world, which is quite cool, right? I have my toolbox, I have my accessories, I can see my virtual media, I can configure app scale, etc. And so the only thing I need to do is click on remote control. And then it opens up. And so if I go to my personal information, I can see my username, I can see my language and maybe change it. My login password is already set. I can modify my email address. I can connect to Google. If I'm fed up, I can delete this account and or I can enable two-factor authentication. So let's do two-factor authentication for this account. And after having scanned it, I do next. I enter my two-factor authentication code and my two-factor again is enabled. And again, I have the same problem that I don't have any backup codes that I can download. At least they're persistent. And now if I click on my devices and I have more than one device, well, I can still add a device. And here I have the option to bind with code and I just need to enter my 8-digit code, which I've previously seen, and my device will automatically be added. And if I have more than one device, probably that my screen wall would allow me to add more than one devices and to have a view. And now, after having connected to the cloud service, if you click on this, we can see with what username we're connected, we can see device ID, the device MAC and your serial. So, a quick update to the latest version and certain things have changed. Here, specifically for version 1.7.2, suddenly I can change the host name as well. Still only for the local domain, but if I have multiples, I can have GL-KVM1 till whatever local name you want to give for it. Another issue that I had after upgrading is I had to go back to my device identity and I had to play around with a multitude of USB devices in order for my keyboard to rework. And currently the GL-KVM or the Logitech weren't working anymore. And so I got it working back on Corsair Gaming RGB. So when choosing now Logitech, suddenly the mouse is working, but not the keyboard. Even though I have the Logitech support, well, I can do whatever I want, but no keyboard. When switching to the Microsoft keyboard, that seems to work. And the Dell keyboard works as well. And so using the GL keyboard. And so when I try the same thing on my Android tablet, I'm using an IP address because I'm running on a virtual machine and it doesn't have access to the DNS. So again, I have a certification warning, but if you have configured correctly all the certificates, you won't have a certification warning. You just go to advanced and you proceed. And here again, I need to give my password and log in. And at first view, I can see everything. I can see my mouse move. Slower, but I can still see it. I can move along. And the video even plays. So if it's even working without a problem on a virtual tablet, imagine having it on a physical one. For those remote debugging sessions, not a problem. And if this works locally, of course, the GL KVM will also work. So I connected to my Android mobile phone, and for simplicity, I'm using an emulator. And there I go to the App Store, and then I type GL KVM, and I just need to install. And it's quite small, and so it's installed. And now I simply need to open it up. And then again, you have the option to use email, username, or continue with Google. And I'll enter my username and my very complex password, and I simply click login. And of course, since I've activated two-factor authentication, I need to do it again here. So I enter my code, and I can choose to trust the device or not. I'll simply choose done. And now, as you can see, I'm connected, the same device as before, very simple. And now I'll click on it, and it's connecting to my device. It asks for the password, which I've encoded on the device. And now I've encoded the password, and I choose connect. And so unfortunately, it switches the other way around. So thankfully, I'm on an emulator, so I can do the same thing. And so now my phone is turned. I choose got it. It shows me how to navigate, simple tap, double tap, long press, two fingers, etc. But basically, as you can see, when I do something on my mobile phone, it immediately responds on the device itself. Pretty neat, right? I even have a keyboard, but again, it's in QWERTY. I even have some settings. I can cut or not the speaker. I have a user guide. Again, I can choose between smart mode and normal mode. I can even change the resolution if I want to, but it's more basic than in the browser. But if you're on the road and you need to take something over, it's perfectly doable. And of course, end control shuts it out. And the arrow down doesn't have anything. And now I have connected my Comet Pro to my MikroTik RB5009 located under my desk. And I started up Winbox and I launched Torch specifically on my Ethernet port connected to the Comet Pro. And I had to temporarily disable hardware offloading to see all traffic flowing through. And after a couple of minutes of reboot, this is the traffic which is flowing more or less. Currently, my Comet Pro should not be making any outside calls and should not be connected to the internet because my GL.iNet services, cloud services, are currently disabled. And so, after a reboot, there's still quite a lot of traffic. Well, we have the MikroTik discovery, we have broadcasts from other machines, we have multicast. The first traffic line we see coming from our Comet Pro is a 5353 UDP request for the multicast DNS, and then it's doing lookup to my DNS servers, then it's doing lookup to 111 to all public DNS servers, and currently that isn't blocked. Then next there's NTP calls to retrieve time, which is still more or less normal. Even though an NTP server is provided through DHCP, he's still going to the NTP server he chooses. Then you can see HTTPS traffic coming in from my local workstation, which is still normal. Then again, there's some different broadcasts. And even though it shouldn't be going to the internet, here it's going to the IP address 74.125.250.129. And looking up that IP address, that are the Google Stun server. And Stun stands for Session Transversal Utility for NAT, and it might be used for WebRTC to determine its public IP, to establish possible NAT bindings, etc. And it's still making a lot of NTP requests, and after a while it kinda slows down, with the exception of the stuns. And now I'm doing the same thing, but I'm filtering specifically on my source IPv4. I'm going to even remove IPv6, and I only see IPv4 addresses. And I'm going to reboot again and see what still comes through. So now, as a quick test, I've intervened, and even though the traffic to port 19302 UDP is still going out, on a firewall level further down the road, I blocked it, and so we don't see any traffic for these requests. And I can still connect to my device without a problem. Currently, I'm still in WebRTC. I can still do whatever I need to do. And now, on my MikroTik router in Torch as a source address, I specified my Comet Pro, and as the destination address, I specified my local machine. And what do we see? On one side, we see the HTTPS port, probably from the browser, and next to that, we see a port 38820, which is our WebRTC port. And so all large data goes over that port. And if we look at the configuration, well, we are in WebRTC. So let's play some traffic, and we can clearly see that traffic is coming through. We are receiving data. Now if in the configuration we switch to direct, normal, we won't have any sound. And in Firefox, normal doesn't even play for me. However, if I do look to traffic, I can clearly see that everything is now going to HTTPS and WebSockets. And so now I'm still connected to my GL KVM through the internet. And if I go back to my firewall and to Torch, well, here we can see the connection established to port 3900 on 38114 on 38 on this IP address. And when looking up that IP address, we can't find any information about it. But coming from the firewall, we clearly see some traffic is going there. Well, of course, no device is perfect. For the job that I need to do, it just suits my scenario quite well. So what could be better? Well, since this is a nice device who can show your time 24/7 if you want, and since I live in Europe, it would be very nice to, next to a time zone, to be also able to configure when the winter time or summertime starts, with a start date, an end date, etc. Because now, if I want that, when the time switches, I need to configure it to have the right time. And that applies for the US as well. Something which I would also like as a feature, both for the online as the offline, is that when you configure two-factor authentication, that you're able to have backup keys and that you can restore them. For the offline version, well, worst case scenario, you just do factory reset. For the online version, well, you're screwed. And something which in my scenario, and probably a lot of guys like me who are having a high-end workstation would like to see, is to have a DisplayPort version. Since currently this only has two HDMIs at 4K 30 Hz. My local computer has an RTX 5090. And in order for me to even make it work, I need to have a DisplayPort to HDMI conversion cable and a second HDMI to DisplayPort conversion cable. And even if I get that, well, I have a downgrade from 60 Hz to 30 Hz, which makes streaming or something else more difficult. But that's my wish list. Another nice to have is, if you really want to have it in locally only mode, to have a flag to disable the dial home. Even if it's not connected to the GL KVM, it still dials home to Google stun servers. Of course, there's a way around it. First of all, if you have your own firewall and you can put in restrictions, you could configure firewall rules to disable those traffic. The cheaper version would be simply to configure a static IP address without a gateway. And that way, the device can't even dial out. Another risk for this device is that potentially, if you have somewhere a computer in the back under your desk, somebody might simply plug it in on your router or on your Wi-Fi, and it can be a perfect spy device. But hey, every advantage has a disadvantage. Now, if you guys enjoy this content, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell sign. Or leave a comment down below.